The World Bank, a name synonymous with global development, poverty eradication, economic progress. Or is it? For decades, we've been fed a narrative of benevolence, a beacon of hope for struggling nations. But what if that narrative is a carefully constructed facade, concealing a much darker, far more insidious truth? What if the World Bank wasn't just sometimes corrupt, but was designed to be corrupt, its very foundation steeped in a history of control, exploitation, and an unwavering pursuit of power disguised as humanitarian aid? This isn't hyperbole. This is a deep dive into the architects of global finance and the blueprints they followed. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew. This isn't just about controversial loans or failed projects that went sideways. This is about the genesis of a global financial titan, born from the ashes of World War II, not solely to rebuild war-torn Europe, but to strategically reshape the world in its own image. Bretton Woods, 1944. The official story paints a vivid picture of collaboration, of visionary leaders like John Maynard Keynes, and Harry Dexter White forging a new international economic order, aiming for stability and prosperity. But beneath the polished surface, a different agenda simmered, an agenda of immense influence, undeniable leverage, and the strategic positioning of Western creditor nations to dictate the economic future of burgeoning post-colonial and developing economies. This wasn't merely about aid, it was about establishing a new form of global economic governance, subtly shifting power dynamics under the guise of reconstruction. Its initial mandate was indeed reconstruction, primarily of Europe, but swiftly and with profound implications, that shifted to development for the global South. And in that pivotal shift, the seeds of perpetual debt and systemic dependency were sown with alarming precision. Was it truly about lifting nations out of generational poverty, or about creating captive new markets for industrial goods, securing reliable access to vital raw resources, and ensuring geopolitical alignment during the tense ideological battlegrounds of the Cold War? Consider the early beneficiaries. Not always the neediest nations suffering humanitarian crises, but often those strategically vital to Western geopolitical and economic interests. Development aid rapidly transformed into a potent weapon, a velvet glove around an iron fist, capable of bending sovereign wills. Countries found themselves subtly, then overtly incentivized to adopt specific economic policies, predominantly neoliberal market reforms, that opened their nascent markets to foreign corporations, mandated the privatization of lucrative public assets, and systematically dismantled essential social safety nets. This wasn't charity driven by pure compassion, it was conditional compliance, often with devastating long-term consequences for local populations. The evidence of this systemic approach is overwhelming and meticulously documented. From the infamous structural adjustment programs, SAPs, of the 1980s and 90s that brutally crippled countless African, Latin American, and Asian economies, forcing draconian austerity measures that drastically cut public spending on education, healthcare, and other essential services, to colossal infrastructure projects. These projects, often funded by the World Bank, displaced millions of indigenous peoples and rural communities, irreparably destroyed delicate ecosystems, and almost invariably lined the pockets of corrupt local officials and powerful multinational corporations, often headquartered in donor nations. Think of the controversial Narmada Dam projects in India, the widespread displacement and environmental damage caused by bank-backed mining operations across Africa, or destructive logging concessions in Southeast Asia. These weren't isolated missteps or unfortunate accidents. They represent systemic patterns of decision-making, driven by economic models that consistently prioritize abstract GDP growth figures and investor returns over genuine human well-being, prioritizing export-led development over local food security and self-sufficiency. And the interest, always rigorously demanded and paid back, often at exorbitant rates, by the very people supposedly being helped. This is the core mechanism of the debt trap. a complex, carefully constructed cycle that binds entire nations to international creditors, severely limiting their economic sovereignty, dictating their national budgetary choices, and foreclosing alternative development paths. When a nation inevitably struggles under the weight of these conditions and loans, the World Bank often steps in with more loans, more conditions, further entrenching the dependency, creating a seemingly inescapable spiral. It's a financial hydra. Cut off one head of debt and two more grow in its place, each more constrictive than the last. This isn't merely unfortunate, it's a strategically designed mechanism of control, keeping nations perpetually indebted and therefore perpetually compliant. Who truly benefits from this intricate, often opaque web of global finance? It's demonstrably not the impoverished farmers displaced from their ancestral lands by World Bank-funded agribusiness, nor the struggling communities whose vital water sources are polluted by bank-backed industrial projects, nor the desperate citizens whose essential public services are privatized and sold off for pennies on the dollar, often to foreign entities. The primary beneficiaries are consistently opaque, often the very multinational corporations, financial institutions, and political elites who vigorously champion these development models, reaping enormous profits from cheap labor, readily available raw materials, and newly opened markets. A privileged few consolidate wealth, while the global majority bears the true cost. Let's talk about the deeply concerning revolving door phenomenon. High-ranking World Bank officials frequently originate from and often return to the very corporations, investment banks, and financial institutions that stand to gain directly from the bank's loan policies, project funding, and structural adjustment prescriptions. Is this merely a series of unfortunate coincidences? Or is it an inherent design flaw, ensuring that the institution's agenda remains consistently and fundamentally aligned with global corporate and financial interests, rather than genuinely serving the dire needs of the truly impoverished populations it claims to assist? The transparency so often promised in its public statements frequently proves to be an illusion, shrouded in layers of complex financial instruments, impenetrable bureaucratic jargon, and deliberately obscured decision-making processes. The World Bank's internal accountability mechanisms, supposedly designed to prevent and address malfeasance, historically, they have been revealed as remarkably weak, painfully slow, and often toothless in their execution. Investigations into allegations of fraud, corruption, and environmental and social harms within its own projects have frequently been met with formidable internal resistance, systematically downplayed or quietly shelved without meaningful action. When courageous whistleblowers dare to emerge from within the institution, they frequently face severe professional repercussions, ostracism, and even career destruction. This is not the behavior of an institution genuinely committed to self-correction and transparent reform. It is the telling behavior of an institution fiercely protecting its core operational model and the vested interests it serves. So the critical question arises, was it always corrupt? Perhaps not in the explicit Hollywood-style bribe-in-a-suitcase sense from its absolute inception. But the very structure, the foundational ideology, and the inherent power dynamics embedded in its DNA from its earliest days created an environment not just susceptible to, but inherently ripe for systemic corruption, pervasive exploitation, and the subjugation of sovereign national economic choice. It was meticulously designed to exert pervasive influence to manage and direct the global economic playing field in a very specific, predetermined way, often and demonstrably at the expense of a genuine equitable and sustainable development for the majority. The aid always came with an elaborate web of strings, and those strings were expertly woven into a vast controlling network of dependency. It's fundamentally a story of raw, unadulterated power, not selfless altruism. It's a compelling narrative of sophisticated economic engineering, not pure humanitarianism. A story where the global poor are not merely passive beneficiaries, but far too often unwitting pawns in a much larger, high-stakes geopolitical and economic game, manipulated by forces far beyond their control. The question isn't whether individual bad actors occasionally existed within the World Bank. They always do in any large institution. The truly profound question is whether the institution itself, from its very conception at Bretton Woods, carried within its foundational blueprint the seeds for an inherently flawed, self-serving system. A system where the fervent pursuit of development consistently served to entrench existing global power structures, meticulously create new forms of economic dependency, and ensure the continuous, often one-way flow of wealth from the resource-rich global south to the industrialized global north. When you peel back the numerous layers of carefully crafted public relations campaigns, glossy annual reports, and lofty mission statements adorning its headquarters, what you ultimately find is not a pristine history of unblemished virtue or unwavering integrity. You uncover a complex, often brutal, and deeply controversial legacy of decisions that have profoundly shaped the destinies of billions of people across continents, frequently and tragically for the worse. And the truth, once rigorously uncovered and acknowledged, is far more chilling, far more systemic, and far more enduring than any simplistic tale of good intentions gone awry. The World Bank, not just accidentally corruptible at times, but arguably structurally corrupt from its very inception. An institution whose secret, untold history reveals not a benevolent path to global prosperity for all, but a meticulously paved highway of overwhelming influence, strategic control, and calculated exploitation. The long-cherished narrative of pure benevolence is not just challenged, it is utterly shattered, revealing the stark, uncomfortable reality of a financial leviathan wielding immense, often unchecked power and frequently leaving a trail of devastating social and environmental consequences in its wake. Are you prepared to truly see the World Bank for what its historical record, its operational patterns, and its inherent biases demonstrate it to be? The curtain has been emphatically pulled back. The real story begins now. Don't just accept the official version. Demand the truth